What's good, big dogs? Welcome back into the BDGE Dynasty channel. My name is Adam. If you're new to the channel, go down and hit the subscribe button. You don't want to miss any of the content that we're bringing to you every single week here on the game of Dynasty. And when I say every single week, I mean that sincerely. As you can see, I'm not in my normal digs here. I'm actually on vacation, supposed to be taking a little time away to recharge the batteries. But here's the thing. I could not take time away from doing a video this week on the BDG Dynasty channel. I told you I'll be doing the second part of a two-part series covering Dynasty startups and drafting in particular from the back half of drafts, picks 7 through 12. So even on vacation, I had to figure out a way to get this video to you. Went down to the hotel lobby, said, listen, I need a little spot that I can make a video for the BDG Dynasty channel. And they said, say less. We're going to go ahead and give you the ballroom. We're going to talk some ball. And as you can see behind me, kind of looks like, I don't know, they're going to be doing some kind of a business meeting in here in the morning, probably. So we're going to get right into business. But before we do that, in or out of town, you already know what we got to do. We got to do this the right way. Let's tuck them. Tuck them shirts in, man. Stop yapping. And let's talk drafting from the caboose of this draft. All right, so let's get straight into this here. And this is, as I said, the second part of a two-part series where we're drafting in Dynasty startups, talking a lot more on the strategy side of things, in particular, what's going on in 2024 drafts, and the best ways, I think, to approach drafting from a specific draft spot. Basically, we're going to be covering the 7 through 12 spot, that specific range, in the second part of this series. If you missed part 1 and you have a pick in picks 1 through 6, also if you want a refresher or just some guidelines, some basic rules and principles that I think are important to note in Dynasty startups, that was in the beginning of part 1 as well. I'm not going to be recovering that today. In part 1, we talked about drafting from the early part of drafts, and I think it's really important in that spot that you're drafting the quarterbacks, the elite ones in that range. Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, CJ Stroud, Joe Burrow. And I think it's really important to go ahead with those early picks and lock those guys up, because by the time it gets back to you in round 2, a lot of the really high-end quarterbacks can already be gone depending on the draft that you're in. And definitely in a lot of these third-round reversal drafts, by the time you get to the third round, the quarterback pool is completely depleted as far as the elite quarterbacks go. And really the whole idea of third-round reversal is the fact that you have one of those early picks and you're able to lock down such an elite quarterback in a Superflex league. They basically have to offset the back part of the draft because that is such an advantage. If all things were equal, everybody would prefer to have Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, those elite type quarterbacks. For the most part, everybody's going to prefer those guys relative to what the field has to offer at the quarterback position. Now, the exciting part though, if you're drafting in these picks 7 through 12, is the fact that third round reversal exists. And you basically have to be okay knowing you're not going to get Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes. Those guys are not going to fall to you. However, in part 1, we talked about how there are times where a guy like Joe Burrow or Lamar Jackson, those guys could end up falling to the late part of the first round in a 12-team Superflex draft, depending on how high people want to push receivers up the board. If you had the 112 spot, let's say, you're going to have a chance to have the 12th, the 13th pick in the draft, and also you'll get the 25th pick in the draft. So having 3 of the top 25 picks in the draft actually really does, in my opinion at least, help offset not having an elite option guaranteed to be at your disposal in that top 4 range, let's say. Now, if you do have a pick between 7 and 12, this is where I now think it's appropriate to start drafting guys like CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, and basically whether you have the 7th pick or the 12th pick and you're drafting right there on the turn, what I'm looking to do in this spot is secure 2 of what I believe are the most elite players left on the board. That list is basically, in the way I'm going to draft, going to be receivers and quarterbacks. Now, I saw in the comments, and I have seen plenty of drafts where people are tempted to go ahead and do the double RB approach. Let's say you got the 111 and the 202, go ahead and lock up Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall, and basically have a big edge over the field at the running back spot. Bijan Robinson, and banking on the fact that Arthur Smith is out of town, that this talent is going to be unleashed and wreak havoc on your league. And as you saw in the back part of last year, a guy like Breece Hall also being dominant. These guys are both young, explosive running backs that can be difference makers. And I certainly can understand the temptation to do that. For me, this is not going to be a strategy that I prefer to do at this part of the draft. And as we get further along in this video, it'll make a lot more sense why. There was a comment out there from the Hall of Famer Rob Gronkowski himself asking me to go ahead and talk about some of the strategy when you get much later into drafts and really how to draft for your bench. I'm going to talk about that, and it'll make a lot more sense as to why I'm not looking to do that. So with that being said, I'm looking to draft the most elite receiver and quarterback combination that is out there. It could be a wide receiver and a quarterback. I could go ahead and get 2 wide receivers, but basically this is the list of guys that I'm looking to get. And the guys on this list are CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Marvin Harrison Jr. At quarterback, if Lamar or Burrow somehow slips down to this range, those are actually guys I think that should be going in the first 6 picks. And if those quarterbacks are not there, Anthony Richardson, Caleb Williams, Kyler Murray, and Jordan Love. If somehow, some way my league mates let me get 2 of what I believe are the elite quarterbacks, I'm just going to go ahead and take that. But if there's a very serious run on quarterbacks, I actually love in the back part of drafts here, going ahead and locking down 2 of the elite receivers. So let's say somehow I was able to get CeeDee Lamb and Marvin Harrison Jr., or Amon-Ra St. Brown and Marvin Harrison Jr., Jamar Chase. If I'm able to get 2 of those 5 receivers in the back part of the draft here, I love locking that down. I lock down some of the most young, exciting players in the game at the receiver position that could be high upside as far as scoring goes. And then I'm also with the early part of the 3rd round and the 3rd round reversal, a guy like Dak Prescott possibly, who also has high-end upside. A guy like Jaden Daniels, who certainly has his question marks, but has some significant rushing upside that could be league-breaking in fantasy. Even if I get a guy like T-Law, although we're certainly at this point not really sure if T-Law possesses that high-end upside that we were hoping for when he came out of Clemson, he still at that point is a very nice pick, given the fact that you have 2 elite receivers. That's still a really nice play. All right, so let's go ahead and dig into some of those same startups that we went over in the first part of this series. This time, going ahead and looking at the back part of the draft. And in particular, there's some people that drafted really well, and I wanted to highlight what took place for them. I think they executed perfectly what I would like to do if I was in the position of some of these drafts. So now the first one here I want to pull up is the Hollywood Huddle. Again, this is a league that Andrew is in. One I want to highlight is this 112 spot first. So Lamar Jackson somehow falls all the way to the 112. I really just don't understand that. Given what we saw from him last year, the fact that he's got a bag now and seemingly isn't going to have these injury problems that were coming up later in the year when he wasn't being paid appropriately, that, and you get to pair that with Anthony Richardson. These are 2 of the most high upside quarterbacks as far as being dynamic in the rushing department, which is a huge boost to your quarterback when it comes to fantasy scoring, the Konami code. And then after you take both of those quarterbacks, a lot more quarterbacks are coming off of the board. Brock Purdy and Jaden Daniels both go in the 2nd round. So now at the 301, you get A.J. Brown. I think this was perfectly executed. You now have Lamar Jackson, Anthony Richardson, and a very high upside player in A.J. Brown. Although he's getting to the later part of his career, only going to be 27 this year, still has plenty of upside and gas in the tank to be your wide receiver 1, given the fact that you do have Lamar Jackson and A-Rich at the quarterback spot. And then I also really want to talk about Parker P23, drafting from the 111 here. He takes Marvin Harrison Jr. ahead of Amon-Ra St. Brown, but because at the turn, Lamar and A-Rich come off the board, it doesn't bite him. He still gets to have Amon-Ra St. Brown with Marvin Harrison Jr. at the 111 spot. I actually love this pairing just as much. And what's interesting in this 3rd round reversal, you can see here in the avatar, this is a Vikings fan, and he definitely jumped the gun. I think even Andrew would admit drafting J.J. McCarthy at the 302 is probably drafting him at his upside. But if we take away the fact that he drafted J.J. McCarthy and reached on him in particular, if you were to sub in Dak Prescott there at the 302, which I think would make a lot more sense, now all of a sudden you have Marvin Harrison Jr., Amon-Ra St. Brown, and a guy who's a little older at the quarterback spot in Dak Prescott relative to the field, but he's only going to be 31 this year and has shown us elite seasons at the quarterback spot. I would have loved that there. And maybe we're going to look back in a year from now and J.J. McCarthy is going to turn out to be him. I'm just personally not at this point in startups drafting him anywhere near the 302. And then the last one I wanted to highlight here is Beast Move, who's at the 109. Takes Jamar Chase. I certainly understand it. I wouldn't be taking him ahead of CeeDee Lamb, but regardless, same tier. Jamar Chase, a great elite player in his own right. Then at the 204, takes Justin Herbert. Now, this is where I think if you were bullish on the running back spot, hindsight 2020 can show you one thing here, but as we go through more drafts, this will explain why I personally wouldn't want to be doing this and drafting a running back at the 204. You could have at the 204 taken Bijan Robinson, the running back 1 off the board, having Jamar Chase and now Bijan Robinson to start, and you could have still gotten Dak Prescott at that 304 spot. Now, ultimately, as far as sequencing goes, I wouldn't really like that, and I wouldn't want to risk not getting Dak Prescott at that 304 spot. But the reality is the inverse, I think, is still better, where you get Justin Herbert, who's a lot younger, and even though he may not quite have the upside that we've seen in the past with Greg Roman and Harbaugh, I still think he's got a very safe floor and is an elite player at the quarterback position. So you can't take that from him. I think I'd still rather have what Beast Move came away with than trying the inverse sequencing there and risking not get Dak Prescott. But that's me. But let me know down in the comments what you'd rather have. If you'd rather have Justin Herbert and Jahmyr Gibbs or Bijan Robinson and Dak Prescott. And interestingly enough, at the 106 spot, that person got Bijan Robinson and then also got Dak Prescott. So let me know down in the comments. Remove the first part, remove the Burrow versus Chase thing, because obviously Beast Move didn't have the chance to draft Jamar Chase at the 109 spot. But would you rather have Bijan Robinson and Dak Prescott, or would you rather have Justin Herbert and Jahmyr Gibbs? Would love to get your feedback on that one. And then as we pivot over to the Gotham City draft, interestingly enough, again, Cujo 07 at the 111 gets Jamar Chase, Bijan Robinson and Dak Prescott. So at the back part of drafts, that's a realistic outcome that you could end up with a Jamar Chase, a Bijan Robinson, and a Dak Prescott. I think a lot of people would really love having those three guys as your first three picks in startups. You still do, in my opinion, get a quarterback with elite upside in Dak Prescott, although I really don't like taking Bijan Robinson this early in drafts. I certainly understand the upside he possesses and wanting to go ahead and have that hammer running back, but for me, I'd much rather have at that 202 spot, Amon-Ra St. Brown personally. Now I'd have Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Dak Prescott, and then when it comes to me at the 411 and turning into the 5th round, now I can continue to address my wide receiver room. And I'm also a really big fan of what Killer Willie did. Getting CeeDee Lamb at the 112 is pretty crazy in my opinion. I love that value. And then at the 201, getting the young upside of Marvin Harrison Jr. being attached to Kyler Murray. Certainly got to love his situation. And then going ahead and sticking with the youth, but the rushing upside of Jaden Daniels at the 301. And you can see at the 412, he gets Jalen Waddle. We're going to get into the 4th round and what's going to come to you there. But I absolutely love, given the fact that you had the last pick in the draft here, I love the outcome for this 112 spot. And now taking a look at this 3rd draft here, CeeDee Lamb at the 109, then at the 204, you take Justin Herbert. You can make cases for other quarterbacks in this range, but I have no qualms with Justin Herbert at the 204 spot in particular. And then at the 304, Puka Nacua is available. I think with a guy like Puka Nacua, the community is going to really want to see him thrive in the production department again next year to start to buy into him. And that's probably why in this draft in particular, he's fallen to the 304. And at this 304 spot, there's no way I'm going to be passing on Puka Nacua. I will say in this draft in particular, I still have Malik Nabers slightly ahead of Puka Nacua, and I could have made the case for him there. But the point is, there is a ton of value still at this 304 spot with Puka and Nabers on the board, as well as Drake London. And Tyreek Hill didn't even go to the 310 in this specific draft. Basically, this is all to highlight. If you do have a pick 7 through 12 in your Dynasty startup, going ahead and securing what you believe is the most elite of the wide receivers or quarterbacks here, you're going to have a very good chance in the early part of the 3rd round to still get a quarterback option or a very high-end wide receiver as well. In this 301 to 306 range, what I'm looking to do is lock down a receiver or a quarterback in one of these guys. Basically, if I can get A.J. Brown, Puka Nacua, Garrett Wilson, Tyreek Hill, or Malik Nabers in this spot, I love that at the 301 to 306. And then at the quarterback spot, I really want to get one of Dak Prescott or Jaden Daniels, preferably. But if I miss out on those two quarterbacks, T-Law or Purdy are guys that I'd be targeting in this range as well. I'm basically going to be locking down 3 really high upside players with these first 3 picks because of the 3rd round reversal, and the large majority of those players are going to also be youngs. And even though I don't get one of those guys, I feel really good if I draft in the back part of the draft if I'm executing this way. Now, when it comes back to you in the 407 to the 412 and the 501 to the 506, basically any one of those picks, 407 to 506 here, there's a ton of receivers I'm looking to lock down. There are a couple quarterbacks I want to go over too, but basically at this point, I'm still looking to build out my stable and arsenal of receivers. If somehow Rome Odunze falls to you in this range, I feel like there's just no way possible for me to pass him up personally. This is a guy that only would be there just because simply the presence of Keenan Allen this season, as well as DJ Moore. But the reality is this is a high upside player, extremely talented, drafted inside the top 10, and is also going to be attached to a quarterback that's as talented as Caleb Williams. I feel like in this range, he's a steal. And if I wasn't able to steal Rome Odunze at this spot, there's so many other receivers in this range: Brandon Ayuk, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, Michael Pittman, DJ Moore, Nico Collins, Zay Flowers, DK Metcalf, all those receivers in this range I would love to get. And especially at this point, if I've only drafted one quarterback, let's say, if this is my wide receiver 3 and 4 through 5 rounds, at this point, I'm loving the way that my draft is sitting, given what I've done in the first 3 rounds. Now, let's say in those first 3 rounds, you only got one quarterback in that range, and you got 2 of those receivers. At this point, in the 5th round in particular, there are a couple super flex options I would be willing to get if somehow they fall to you. The large majority of drafts, I don't think they'll be there. But if somehow Jared Goff or Tua Tagovailoa is there in the 5th round, more than happy to go ahead and make either Goff or Tua my super flex spot. Now I have 2 quarterbacks that I feel really good about inside the top 15, 16 range, as well as 3 receivers that I feel really good about through the first 5 rounds of the draft. And those are pretty much going to be the only positions that I'm looking to draft here. I know at this point you'll see a lot of drafts where you'll see some of the tight ends coming off the board in tight end premium leagues, as well as the running backs. Now when it comes to the running back position, basically, I am good on drafting any of the running backs in this range in the 4th or the 5th. But if you really wanted to take a home run swing on the running back position, there's basically one caveat that will meet the exception for me, and that's going to be Devon Achane. Basically, if you're going to draft Achane, you're kind of acknowledging that the size concerns and the floor for him is not necessarily a stable one. But this is just a swing for the fences. And at this point, if he's a 5th round pick and you do have 2 quarterbacks and 2 wide receivers, let's say, or a really good quarterback with 3 very solid receivers, the core of your team is good enough at this point, I think, to take a swing on Devon Achane at this point. He could be league winning if he was able to stay healthy. Now, here's the thing, though, when it comes to the tight end position, especially because you're drafting at the back part of the draft here, and the 5th round is going to be that early part of the 5th, the 501 to the 506. I just feel like the tight ends in this range, you're probably going to be drafting a little bit ahead of where they should be going, I think, relative to the scoring in most leagues. Essentially, if I was going to take one here in the 5th round, it's going to have to be one that I'm really highly convicted on, and I'll have to know that the tight end premium is actually pretty significant in this format. Now, for reference, everything we're talking about here in this specific video is a 12-team Superflex start 10 with a tight end premium of 1.75. So at that point, 1.75 tight end premium, it's meaningful enough to consider a tight end here, but it's still not quite enough for me at this spot because of all those receivers I mentioned earlier. Now, at this point through 5, my ideal build is basically going to give me 2 quarterbacks and 3 wide receivers, or 1 quarterback and 4 wide receivers at this point. And now again at this 607 to the 706, when it comes back to us in the 6th and 7th round, also optimally looking to grab just more of these wide receivers. There's some that are just really strong dynasty values. There's some that are very high upside and young players. And there's also in this range a few guys that I'd be looking to draft, which are getting to the older side and when it comes to their age in dynasty, but the production they could offer me, even in a shorter window now, 1 or 2 years, something that I'm not really looking to pass up on in this 6th or 7th round. Basically, the guys in that range are going to be JSN, Jordan Addison, Tank Dell, T. Higgins, George Pickens, Xavier Worthy, Brian Thomas Jr., Jaden Reed, Debo Samuels, and the aging Mike Evans is somebody I'm absolutely looking to grab in the 7th round. Now, while I definitely would love to grab 2 of those receivers and basically get up to 5 or 6 receivers on my team and my roster construction, if possible, through these first 7 rounds, at this point, if I don't have my Superflex spot drafted on my team, I don't have my second quarterback. Now, this is where I'm going to start keeping a lot of tabs on my league mates and really paying attention to what their draft is looking like. Basically, what I'm doing at this point is seeing how many teams in my league have drafted a second quarterback and might at this point not be looking to grab their quarterback 3 and kind of continue to let the quarterbacks fall down the board. Or at this point is my queue of quarterbacks that I'm comfortable drafting starting to shrink. And as I look around, there's also a lot of teams that don't have their quarterback 2. I can basically now make a decision on, do I need to draft my Superflex spot now in the 7th, or do I really want to take a chance and risk it to the 8th round? And when it comes back to us, we got these 2 picks in between the 807 and the 906. In this spot, I'm now looking to basically build out my team in the most optimal way possible, regardless of position. So now things have gone my way at this point. I actually haven't drafted any running backs. And once we get to this 807 pick, all the way through the draft, there are just so many running backs that I feel comfortable drafting and putting onto my team. And basically the way I want to build my optimal team build, my roster construction is going to be basically piling up as many of these running backs that have an opportunity to get on the field as possible. There's just so many injuries that happen to the running back position throughout the season. A lot of running backs that right now we can't project for workhorse roles or for big time workloads, but the injury in front of them is going to give them that opportunity. And basically at the running back position, especially when I'm not having to invest a lot of capital in there, I don't necessarily care how great they are. If I know that the volume is going to be there, opportunity is what I'm chasing. So there's just so many running backs in this range that I'm going to be looking to draft and start building out the core of my team as far as the running back position goes. Basically, I kind of build my team at the running back position with volume. And again, if I haven't secured my Superflex spot, there's a lot of quarterbacks in this range that I think could be there for you. Guys like Deshaun Watson, Baker Mayfield, Matt Stafford, Will Levis could even be there. And in this 8th round range, I also would be willing to make Michael Penix my Superflex spot, my quarterback 2 on my team. And you're probably looking at me like, Adam, he's not going to play for at least this year, maybe not even next year. And while that's the case, I basically am going to draft him and lock him into my taxi squad until he's going to get on the field, which could come in the next 2 seasons. A little over a month ago, I did an entire video covering Michael Penix and why I believe he's such a value in rookie drafts, and also here in the startup if it is in the 8th round or later. Willing to go ahead and draft him there and then basically draft some of these crusty guys to try to get me by until Penix takes over the starting job. Guys like Russell Wilson, Daniel Jones, Geno Smith that are much, much later in drafts, 13th, 14th, 15th round. I'd be willing to draft them as my quarterback 2, try to patchwork together that Superflex spot until Penix was given the keys for the Falcons. And in this 8th, 9th round especially, I'm starting to look at the tight end position. These 3 guys in particular in this range I would love to draft. Evan Ingram, David Njoku, and George Kittle. And there's still so much value at the wide receiver position. If you wanted to continue to build out your wide receiver room, depending on how many you've drafted at this point, I'm all aboard doing that too. Some of the guys I mentioned possibly drafting in round 6 and 7 were Mike Evans and Jaden Reed. I've seen a lot of times those guys even fall into round 8. So if they're there in round 8, obviously I'd be willing to draft them there. If you're willing to draft more age and you're looking for just 1 or 2 years of production, guys like Amari Cooper and Cooper Kupp certainly could be guys in this 8th, 9th round range that you could get. And as we get more into the 9th round, I'm definitely interested in guys like Chris Godwin and Christian Kirk. While at this point, they're probably unlikely to give you top 12 finishes at the receiver position, being a true wide receiver 1, these are guys that absolutely could be wide receiver 2s. And if you are at this point looking to draft some of these rookies, guys like Xavier Legette and Ricky Pearsall are also receivers that I'd be willing to draft in this range. Now, circling back to the running back position, in the laundry list of running backs that I'm willing to start drafting in this 8th round range and later, Now what I want to do is get into Rob Gronkowski's question, where he's basically asking, what do you want to do as far as drafting the later rounds? Essentially, how do you want to build out your bench? This is where I think it's really important to think about your roster construction and how you want to build your team. So for some people that want to draft their running backs in the first or second round, you want to take guys like Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, maybe in the third, fourth, fifth round, Jahmyr Gibbs, Devon Achane, whoever it may be. Now, if you're just going to draft one running back in the first 5 rounds, at that point, totally different conversation. Is essentially what you're going to be doing is what's called a hero RB strategy, where you have one really high valued dynasty running back that also offers significant upside in the points per game department. Now, if you were in the first and second round and you wanted to stack Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall, let's say, and then again in the 5th round, you want to take a guy like Saquon Barkley or Devon Achane, that's a totally different conversation. You're building your team around the running back position. Now, if you are somebody that does want to build your team around the running back position, just table that for a second. Let me go ahead and walk through this process in the way that I like to build my team in the roster construction. And then if you do want to build your team around the running back position, just kind of think of it in the inverse and how you want to plan your attack with roster construction kind of in the opposite mold. And basically between the way that I would like to optimally draft and the way that I want to roster construct my team, combined with the fact that even though the running back position is being devalued as much as it has been, the running back position as a whole is valued less than I've ever seen it in Dynasty. There's still so many running backs in this range that I want to draft and just put on my team. Circling back to this running back position, it'd kind of be like bringing sand to the beach. Depending on your draft, in the 8th round, you can get guys like DeAndre Swift, Jonathan Brooks, Trey Benson, Derrick Henry, Najee Harris, Alvin Kamara, Tajay Spears, Ramondre Stevenson, and Zamir White, all in this range. And when it comes to roster construction, this is another thing that I also actually really love to use the WoRP tool for. If you go to southharmonff.com/WoRP, on that WoRP tool, there's a tab that's called roster construction. Now, how the roster construction tab works, it's going to take into account your specific league. It's going to take into account the scoring of the league, how many total roster spots you have, and then also how many starting spots you have. Now, what I'm going to do is show you 2 different roster construction tabs for 12-team Superflex leagues, starting 10 players that are lineup leagues. Now, the first one here you're going to be looking at is Fade the Fetal. This is a BDGE league. In this league, there's 32 roster spots, and we're starting 10 players. When you factor in the scoring of the league, that we're starting 10 players, and that there's 32 total roster spots. Now, this is what the WoRP calculator believes is the optimal roster construction. Obviously, this isn't etched in stone as fact. This is subject to the person that is running and managing the team. But the optimal roster construction from the WoRP calculator here, it shows you quarterback 4.0, running back 5.42, the tight end position 3.25, and then the wide receiver position 6.24. Now you'll see this big number here of droppable at 12.92. Now, what I want to do is also go over another league here. This is a standard PPR league with 25 roster spots, just to give you a little bit of the difference. So in this league here, it's saying 3.92 at the quarterback position, very similar to 4. The running back position goes from 5.42 down to 5.08. The tight end position basically stays the same, 3.33 going to 3.25. And then the wide receiver position, 6.75 goes down to 6.42. But the big difference here is the droppable number from 5.92 to the 12.92. Now, I don't want to kill you with numbers and overwhelm you with that. Believe me, I'm on vacation. The last thing I want to do is a whole bunch of math. But the whole idea behind this is based on your league, the WoRP calculator is going to give you some optimal numbers to keep in roster for each position based on the scoring format and the scarcity of the league. So basically, I use this as a guide. It doesn't have to be an end-all, be-all. And again, in a 12-team Superflex league where we're starting 10 players, obviously, I'd like to optimally build around high-end quarterback options, feel very secure about the quarterbacks I have there. And aside from that, build my team around the high-end wide receiver position. And in the large majority of 10-team leagues, you're going to be looking at 3 receivers that you can start with 2 total flex spots, or the inverse, where you have 2 receivers you can start, or a total of 3 flex spots. But either way, every single week, I can start 5 receivers. And that's where I like to use this WoRP tool in the roster construction tab, and it really comes in handy for me. And basically, I want to build my team around having 5 optimal starters at the receiver position, and then obviously accounting for in the season, the bye weeks that are going to be coming, as well as attrition. Unfortunately, we don't want to have injuries, but they're very likely to happen. 1 or 2 people possibly getting hurt. This is where this WoRP tool calculator makes a lot of sense for me in the way I want to build. I basically feel very comfortable having somewhere between 6 or 7 receivers that I feel good putting into my starting lineup on a weekly basis. And having 6 or 7 of those receivers that I've invested in that I feel like have some sort of a combination of high-end production as well as some sort of dynasty value floor. Now, the easy way to think about this droppable number in a vacuum, essentially, this is the number of roster spots that you should have on your team that you feel comfortable dropping or cutting these players on your team. And this is something that for me personally, I've had to learn the hard way. Basically trying to figure out what a roster clogger consists of. They're basically guys that have some sort of name cachet or are high enough up the depth chart on NFL teams that you feel like there is some sort of dynasty value attached to this player, and you're not going to be willing to cut that person to the waiver wire. And while that makes sense, the problem is a player like, for example, Juju Smith-Schuster now. While there's some name cachet there and nobody wants to cut Juju Smith-Schuster to the waiver wire, how many weeks would you feel great about starting Juju Smith-Schuster going into this part of his career? Based on what we saw last year, based on what his career trajectory has been at this point, I'm not going to say that it's impossible. It's never going to happen. But I would never feel good about starting Juju at this point unless he shows me something significantly different than what his career arc has been. In my mind, there's just so many receivers that kind of fit this bill of a roster clogger. And not that they can't have meaningful weeks. Maybe there's a couple weeks during the year where they go out and have 50, 80, even 100 yards and a touchdown or two. But can you predict when those weeks are going to happen? And are you ever going to put them into your lineup and actually secure those points and help your team win? And at least for me in the past, I typically was not able to pinpoint when a lot of these type of receivers are actually going to have the week that I want them in my lineup. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody that you're going to be drafting later on in the draft is guaranteed to be a roster clogger at the wide receiver position. There's certainly guys like Puka Nacua, who you drafted very late in drafts last year, that paid off for you. Even Tank Dell this time last year wasn't someone you had to invest significant draft capital in a rookie draft or a startup draft. And then there's cases like Odell Beckham Jr. Obviously, at this point, Odell is in the back half of his career, but he did actually give you some windows last year where if you just played him on a consistent basis, he gave you a couple wide receiver 1 weeks, sprinkled in with some wide receiver 2 and 3 numbers. Then you have guys like Pop Douglas, who last year, because of an injury in front of him, started to get more snap share and actually did give you some meaningful weeks, a lot of wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 weeks at that position. So I'm not saying it's impossible for wide receivers that you're drafting here not to be a roster clogger. But at the wide receiver position, just because there's an injury in front of someone or they get a whole bunch of snaps and supposedly they're going to be given a much larger opportunity, that doesn't necessarily translate to a receiver that we want to start and is actually good for fantasy football. But at least for me, it's a lot clearer when I'm looking at the running back position when that opportunity is going to come. And basically, I'm just looking to find a lot of these running backs that I'm drafting in this 8th round all the way down the rest of my drafts where they find themselves in a position to where I can say, okay, they are clearly the starter and someone that I want to put in and out of my lineup on a weekly basis. And what I want to do is go through the 2023 season and give you a whole bunch of different ways that this can look and actually be very optimal when I'm trying to roster construct my team in this way. So first, at the running back position, you talk about a guy like Jerome Ford, who finished at the running back 16 last year. Given how great Nick Chubb was, nobody was projecting Jerome Ford to be anything other than a spellback. Nobody actually projected Jerome Ford to get a meaningful role on this Browns team. And then even if he did get that meaningful role, not that many people were going to say this is going to be a top 20 running back on the full season. He finishes at running back 16. You take a look at a guy like Gus Edwards. He finished at running back 25 on the year. Obviously, a lot of that was baked into his touchdown upside and the fact that they just gave him the ball near the goal line. But basically, Gus Edwards, as a touchdown-dependent running back, was almost a running back 2 on the year. Now, these next 3 running backs is a little different for them, and I kind of want to group them together in the way that I present this to you. So these 3 are Chuba Hubbard, Zach Moss, and Devin Singletary. Chuba Hubbard was running back 27, Zach Moss was running back 31, and Devin Singletary was running back 32. But those total year finishes of running back 27, 31, and 32, they really don't do justice to what they actually mean for a team if you were to roster construct this way. People didn't really expect much out of Chuba Hubbard, but with Miles Sanders disappointing with a lot of the touches he got, especially early on in the year, starting in week 5 and then certainly after the bye, Chuba Hubbard was a guy that you could pencil in for a very large workload, high percentage of snaps, and then if you just consistently put him in your lineup, he gave you 3 weeks as a top 13 running back and gave you a total of 8 weeks inside the top 25. But when you roster construct this way and you draft the running back position a lot later on in the drafts, it's a lot easier to see, okay, now Chuba Hubbard has been given a role that I didn't expect, and I clearly can put him into my running back 2 spot, and he's going to be optimal for the team build that I have. Simply just rostering Zach Moss last year with what happened with Jonathan Taylor, the contract situation, and the injury, you basically just automatically started him if you had a team build like this. And because of that, you were able to benefit from the running back 2, 5, and 7 finishes he gave you in his first 5 weeks of the season. You take a look at a guy like Devin Singletary. No one really thought that highly of him after he left Buffalo. And then you look at the Texans situation. Nobody expected C.J. Stroud to be that impactful as a rookie and this team to be nearly as good as it was on the offensive end. There was a whole lot of weeks in the season before Devin Singletary actually was able to get a role that meant something on this Texans offense. But when he did finally get that, he gave you 2 weeks in a row where he was a top 10 running back. And at that point, the role that he had secured on this offense, he was basically an auto start as long as you didn't have a bunch of high-end running backs that you had to start in front of him on a weekly basis. Then when you go much further down the list, these two running backs, when you look at their total year numbers, you're not going to be inspired whatsoever. You take a look at Ty Chandler, running back 48 on the year, and Zamir White, running back 56 on the year. These are guys that early on in the season didn't give you anything, and realistically, there's no way you were starting Zamir White or Ty Chandler. And a little different circumstances for both of these guys. With Zamir White, there was an injury to Josh Jacobs late in the season, and the way that the coaching staff changes affected this team, Antonio Pierce was just running the ball consistently, not really trying to throw the ball much with this team. So Zamir White stepped into the running back one spot on this team that was very run heavy. And then you take a look at the situation Ty Chandler was in Minnesota. They traded for Cam Akers. He ended up tearing his other Achilles. And then clearly in the later part of the year, the Alexander Madison experience was over. They were not really thrilled with that. And Ty Chandler took over the running back 1A spot at least for the Vikings in the back half of the season. When the money was on the line during the fantasy football playoffs, and when teams clearly at that point could say Zamir White is the starter for the Raiders and is somebody I should be starting, same thing with Ty Chandler, you may have had some decisions to make based on how your roster was constructed, but those are two guys that on a weekly basis, you're giving strong consideration to putting into your lineup at the running back spot. And when you look at what they did from weeks 15 to 17 relative to the field at the running back position, Zamir White during the fantasy football playoffs, weeks 15 to 17, he was running back 7 in PPR leagues. And during that time, Ty Chandler was running back 16, gave you the exact same output as Travis Etienne did over those weeks, and outscored guys like Isaiah Pacheco, Devon Achane, who actually did play all of those weeks, and Saquon Barkley over that time. Using the roster construction tab on the WoRP tool, looking at that droppable number, that entire droppable number for me, I'm going to be picking up on the waiver wire every single week. Any running back that has a pulse or somebody that has a chance to get on the field if there is an injury in front of them, or is someone that gets a random workload that we didn't see coming, a guy like Keaton Mitchell, for example, last year. And that in particular is becoming a lot more popular, where people are rostering basically any running back that has a pulse, any running back that has a chance to get on the field. So a lot of times the waiver wire can be really barren when it comes to the running back position. What I want to put that droppable number to as well is quarterbacks that also have an opportunity to be the starting quarterback if an injury was to happen to the quarterback in front of them. You take a look at so many quarterbacks last year that we clearly don't think highly of, did have a chance to step on the field, and even if it wasn't meaningful or they weren't good QBs last year, they actually gave you very usable weeks. A guy like Joe Flacco, who we all assumed career was done at this point, he ended up being really great for teams down the stretch in the fantasy football playoffs. You have guys like Easton Stick, who honestly still looks like a terrible quarterback, but gave you some meaningful weeks. Jake Browning actually stepped in for Joe Burrow and was really competent, gave some very usable weeks as well. So those two positions in particular are going to be where I'm putting the droppable number. And in a format like this, I'd be drafting 2 to 3 tight ends max. I want to have 6, 7, 8 wide receivers that I feel really good about. And if I did have to put them into my lineup, I think they'd be able to give me results that I could live with. And basically, once we get to the 20 plus rounds of drafts, a lot of those receivers in that range, they're not going to be guys that I'm rostering on my team. If somebody like Pop Douglas is available on the waiver wire and I can project a role for him moving forward and he looks good enough to where he may actually return value with the snaps he's getting, maybe I'll put a bid in for Pop Douglas. But what I don't want to do is be using a whole bunch of my roster spots on guys like Pop Douglas, because the reality is if Kendrick Bourne didn't get hurt like he did, we may never have seen Pop Douglas actually matter to the degree he did, and I don't want to be investing in a whole bunch of those wide receivers, which for me are going to feel like roster cloggers that I'm never actually going to feel confident in putting into my lineup. So Mr. Gronkowski, I hope that helps you out and answers your question and really gives you a lot of the insight in how I want to build my team, and then also what I'm looking to draft in the much later parts of the draft. Now, if you listen to all that and you want to go ahead and try to shoot your shot on those hammer running backs, if you still want to go down that path, I think the main thing to take away from this is the roster construction for you. How do you roster construct around that and build your team to have an optimal chance to compete with the field at the other spot? So you got to be going through the later part of the rounds and really trying to pinpoint which of these wide receivers has an opportunity to give you sneaky production and that people are sleeping on at this point in drafts. And that's pretty much all I got. Drafting from the 7 to 12 spot, and then how I like to roster construct and build my team, and then draft to fill my bench in Dynasty startups. Let me know what you thought of this video down in the comments. Doing it on vacation. Did you like the setup? Did you like this format? A little more in-depth as it comes to team building. But I'll see you back here, same time, same place, next week. I'll be back at home. I'm out of this thing. Peace.